relativism and self-refutation. The coherence of relativism has been in question from its very inception, starting with its very first formulation as an explicitly philosophical thesis in Plato's Theaetetus. Relativism has been the target of attacks against its coherence by self-refutation arguments, and these arguments have accompanied it to the very present day. This historical circumstance is not what I want to address here today, although Plato's arguments against Protagoras and one of its successors will play an important role in the systematic point I will try to make regarding the seemingly undiminished attraction self-refutation arguments and relativism still have to one another, even though these arguments have been spectacularly unsuccessful at putting the problem of relativism to rest. What is it that makes relativism in general and radical relativisms in particular such an attractive target to self-refutation arguments? Well, put very offhandedly, one could say that some varieties of relativism are self-refuting, but only if we are very careful about what exactly we mean by that. For reasons that I cannot go into here today, self-refutation arguments that end in very strong conclusions, such as the absolute falsity of the target theory, tend to be unsuccessful. But there are more limited things that can be meant by self-refutation, such as the impossibility of successfully defending a theory. A lot of philosophers, some of them here with us today, such as Max Kölbel, and some of them kept from being here by the contingencies of life, like Maria Bagramian, have, I think, pointed in this direction in their discussion of Plato's argument and of its successors and its systematic consequences. What I would like to do here today is to spell out what exactly lies in that direction. That is a structural feature of certain types of relativism that does indeed make those theories indefensible, although not absolutely false, as self-refutation arguments with more ambitious goals would like to claim. In a nutshell, the thesis I wish to put forward here is that relativist theories are susceptible to self-refutation only if they do not leave room for something I will call normative distance, where normative distance is the name for a distinction between what is brought into a debate or a process of reasoning or something similar and its goal. Normative distance can be instantiated in very different ways. For example, by the distinction between what is true on the one hand and what is merely thought to be true on the other, or the distinction between the justified and the unjustified. Some relativist theories, for example, radically subjectivist theories, have very big difficulties incorporating or making room for any distinctions of the relevant kind. And because of this, they become susceptible to self-refutation arguments of the weak kind. And I would add here, although I won't be able to go into that it is not only relativist theories where this is the case. Self-refutation arguments against determinism, for example, exploit a strikingly similar feature of their target theory. However, as already hinted at, even in the case of these theories, self-refutation arguments that aim to deduce their absolute falsity typically fail. However, even those unsuccessful arguments look way more plausible at a first glance when aimed at theories that do lack normative distance than when aimed at those theories that don't. But such a lack of normative distance is a lacuna in the theory, a gap that needs to be filled if we are even supposed to understand how exactly to deal with or properly criticize or even approach that theory. It is not decisive grounds for falsity. Let me briefly illustrate what exactly I mean by a lack of normative distance by using Protagorean subjectivism as a starting point before proceeding to a more in-depth discussion of Plato's argument against it and some of its more modern predecessors. Plato's Protagoras is, of course, a radical subjectivist. Roughly put, he holds that whatever an individual thinks to be true is indeed true for that individual. Truth is relativized to an individual, or rather to even a time slice of an individual. There is no distinction between what is held to be true and what is in fact true. This is due to the fact that what I will call the framework in what follows, that is, whatever it is that something is relativized to, coincides here with that which is relativized. The measure for truth is what is held to be true, and the thing that is supposed to be measured is that which is held to be true as well. This destroys any possibility for a normative relationship between the framework and whatever is relativized, because for a normative relationship it is essential that what is required can go unfulfilled. But that is obviously not possible when that which sets the requirement and that which is supposed to fulfill the requirement are the very same thing. For this, there would have to be some kind of distance between the two relata, which is precluded by the subjectivist theory of truth. This coincidence of truth and being held to be true suggests a lack of normative distance might be a suitable criterion for rejecting certain explanations and definitions of concepts in epistemology. Many epistemological concepts, like in this case the concept of truth, but also, for example, the concept of justification, are used and often considered to be necessary for entering into a critical examination of our own beliefs. But they are robbed precisely of their ability to fulfill that function when normative distance disappears in their descriptions. Our cognitive endeavors become a one-dimensional stream of consciousness in which there are no better or worse beliefs, and therefore no sense in aspiring to improve one's beliefs. How could there be even an improvement if the requirements are always already met? It is part of the core function of said concepts to enable us to compare and ponder different and conflicting beliefs. They allow us to take an evaluative stance towards our own beliefs and to guide the process of pursuing or giving up, suspending or adapting our beliefs. Put briefly, when normative distance disappears, the possibility of critical reflection does as well. So let's take a look at Plato's self-refutation argument from the Theaetetus and how it exploits that feature on the level of the interpersonal critical reflection that is dialectics. My reading of the argument is heavily indebted to Luca Castagnoli's work. In his reconstruction, which is also printed on the handout, the argument runs as follows. Step 1, according to Protagoras, every judgment is true for the one who judges. 2, Protagoras admits that the judgment of his opponents that he is wrong is true for them. 3, Protagoras admits that what he is saying is false for his opponents. 4, Protagoras' opponents do not admit that one can say something false for them. 5, Protagoras admits that his opponents are right in this as well. 6, Protagoras has to admit that no one is a measure. 7, everyone, including Protagoras, denies Protagoras' theory. And 8, Protagoras' theory is true for no one. The crucial issue here, as in most discussions of this argument, is that the qualifiers, that is, the phrases that indicate for whom something is true, are suspiciously missing in the Platonic text until the very last step. In steps 1 to 7, the argument seems to be talking in the language of an absolutist, not the language of a relativist. The problem here is that the argument wielded by Socrates cannot hit its target, Protagoras' theory, if even the representation it gives of it in step 1 does not describe it correctly, and instead saddles Protagoras with the very absolutist conception of truth that he is arguing against. So a lot of interpreters argue that the qualifiers should be taken to be implied by the text. On the other hand, if the qualifiers are added in every step of the argument, there's no statement of falsity, simplicity, or something similar to be found in the entire argument, except for in the claims of Protagoras' opponents. So there are only statements of falsity for those opponents, and in this case, it is unclear why Protagoras should have to change his mind, or why anything stated in the argument should be problematic for relativism. So the key to finding an interpretation of Plato's self-refutation argument as a successful argument against Protagoras is to explain where and why in the argument we should stop adding qualifiers. That is, where and why Protagoras has to stop using them. In this reconstruction, after step 4, no qualifiers have been added. How exactly is the transition from the relativized steps to the non-relativized step 5 warranted? The answer Protagoras would have to give to remain consistent with his theory would actually just be a relativized version of step 5. So why should he not be able to do that? According to Castagnoli, it is the case that Protagoras cannot make this relativized admission, because a relativized admission in that situation, a relativized admission that his opponents are right in denying that one can say something that is false for them, would have the very same content as Protagoras' statement in step 3, that is, that Protagoras' theory is false for his opponents, thereby apparently denying the previous statement to the effect that there is no such thing. So, according to Castagnoli, Protagoras cannot give a further relativized reply to his opponents because he cannot deny any statements of his opponents without coming into conflict with his own theory. However, it is clearly possible to doubt the adequacy of the characterization of a relativized answer to step 5 as Castagnoli puts it, equivalent to an unqualified denial oddly presented as agreement. At a first glance, the situation with this relativizing move would not be that different from other such attempts. Only from the perspective of his opponents, one could hold, there is a conflict between Protagoras' use of the qualifiers and their belief that there is nothing that is true or false only relatively. For Protagoras, both are compatible. He uses the qualifiers because it is true for him that there is relative truth and falsehood. For his opponents, there is no such thing, and this is why for them it is the case that his claim that there is such a thing is in conflict with their judgment that there is no such thing. From Protagoras' perspective, there is a conflict between statements for his opponents that does not exist for him. And for him, there are facts that demand qualifiers for their proper description that do not exist for his opponents. The situation Protagoras would be describing with another relativized admission seems therefore to be possible and compatible with his theory. This is, viewed from the standpoint of Castagnoli's interpretation, completely acceptable. After all, he stresses that what is demonstrated here is the dialectical untenability of Protagoras' theory and not its necessary falsity. And if the situation described were indeed impossible, Protagoras' theory would simply be false. Then why should Protagoras not be allowed to make this statement? Castagnoli's answer, that is, the equivalency of a relativized admission with blunt disagreement, is in my view incomplete, because it is sufficient to establish that Protagoras cannot only say that his opponent's view is false, but it does not explain why Protagoras could not add an explanation along the lines of the one just given to justify his continuing use of the qualifiers. That is, Protagoras could indeed qualify his denial. However, this strategy would not prove too successful for Protagoras. Not only would it be difficult to argue his way out of the accusation that he disagrees with his opponents through his relativized admission without, for example, implying that his opponents believe that their statement in step 4 is an objection to Protagoras' statement in step 3 is plainly false, and not only so for Protagoras. Rather, it seems impossible that Protagoras could persuade his opponents that his use of the qualifiers is legitimate without showing them, and therefore implying, that they are mistaken about at least something. It is safe to assume that for Protagoras' opponents some indication, or better yet evidence, that one of their beliefs is false is necessary for them to change it. But since Protagoras has to grant them the truth of all their beliefs, he does not have anything he could offer them as a motivation. Protagoras cannot defend his use of the qualifiers without reverting to an argumentative offensive that he cannot possibly win. The decisive point is that Protagoras, if the dialogue is to continue, cannot simply relativize the clashing statements so that they become compatible once again, as he normally does, since he can only either use the qualifiers or not use the qualifiers. He cannot use them for himself and not use them for their opponents. The key move of the argument, therefore, I think, consists in forcing a practical decision on Protagoras in a situation where it is necessary for him and his opponents to interpret what he is doing in the same way. So, although I disagree with his reasons for thinking so, Castagnoli is still right that his reconstruction of the self-refutation argument is successful. But it elevates the dialectical context to the position of an integral element of the argument itself. This is first and foremost obvious in the restriction of admissible argumentative moves for Protagoras through the earlier moves of his opponents. This elevation of the context does not only mean that the self-refutation argument is not free from background assumptions, as some who are convinced that self-refutation arguments possess a very specific kind of purity would argue, but also that it is neither its aim nor does it succeed in demonstrating that Protagorean relativism is false. The self-refutation argument shows, read in this way, how Protagoras, or everyone else who subscribes to his theory, can be forced to admit that his theory is false in a non-relativized fashion, and proceeds to deduce from the now universal assent to the statement that Protagoras' theory is false, that the theory is true for no one. The dialectical context plays an indispensable role here. This is also obvious and underscored by the fact that Plato's argument needs someone who opposes the Protagorean thesis. Without someone to argue for Protagoras being wrong, it simply does not work. Of course, the fact that someone believes that Protagoras' theory is wrong could be introduced as an additional premise, but if it were only mentioned that some people think Protagoras is wrong, this would not mean that Protagoras could not use his qualifiers in a discussion about differing opinions with someone who is either neutral on the matter or just agrees with him. That this version of the argument neither proves that relativism is false nor is intelligible without its dialectical context does not mean that Protagoras would not have to worry about it. This is also made perfectly clear by Castagnoli. It is not a negligible problem for a philosophical thesis if it cannot possibly be defended in a discussion with someone who holds a different view. Neither is it a negligible problem or a philosophical achievement, to demonstrate that a certain theory has this problem. However, this self-refutation argument is far from being a decisive demonstration of the incoherence of relativism in general, even in its more radical forms, since this anti-relativist argument Socrates utilizes a very specific feature of Protagorean relativism that most other relativist theories do not share. The unique weakness of Protagoras' position is that everybody who adopts it has to agree to everything anyone says, which is simply not the case for most eleuthic relativisms. This feature leads to an incapability for criticizing positions that has to be disastrous in every debate. Protagoras lacks a critically utilizable concept of falsity because he cannot at the same time adhere to his theory and tell his opponents that they are wrong in any sense that is at all relevant to them. In other words, Protagoras' theory lacks normative distance. From Protagoras' point of view, his opponents always already have the truth, and they do not need to engage with him to get it. Similarly, Protagoras is unable to relate to his own beliefs in a critical manner or to consciously try to reevaluate them, since he also always already has the truth. He can admittedly believe that his former beliefs were false, and in this case, they are now false for him. However, in every single moment, he is already optimally in doubt regarding truth. He does not need to think about the truth or falsity of his beliefs, and he is not even able to seriously consider that one of his beliefs might be false, because this is just impossible according to his own theory. So, in accordance with how the concept of normative distance was introduced earlier, Protagoras' problem seems to be that according to his theory there is no distance to be covered between what is already present in someone's thoughts or a debate and the goal of thinking or debating. Thinking and debating become, therefore, seen from the perspective of Protagoras, totally useless activities. At least concerning debating, Socrates observes the very same thing when he says, I say nothing of the ridiculous predicament, that's also on the handout, I say nothing of the ridiculous predicament in which my own, this is a weird word, I think it is pronounced midwifery, very is it?
Midwife.
Thank you.
It's a midwife. So.
Yes, it is, which is why I found it very counterintuitive when I looked it up, but thank you. And the whole art of dialectic is placed for the attempt to supervise or refute notions the notions or opinions of others would be a tedious and enormous piece of folly if to each man his own are right, and this must be the case if Protagoras' truth is indeed the real truth. Insofar as Protagoras has to declare debating a tedious and enormous piece of folly, it is not surprising that his theory cannot thrive in a debate environment that does indeed consider debating a purposeful activity. The absence of normative distance thus is a property that makes this position susceptible to self-refutation. However, this provisional result has to be looked at in a more nuanced manner. The discussion of the Platonic argument rested on a simplifying and natural assumption that should not be made when considering radically revisionist theories and epistemology. In the explanation for why there is a lack of distance in Protagoras' theory, it was tacitly accepted that this normative distance has to be embodied by the distinction between truth and falsity, with truth as the goal and falsity as something that has to be gradually and actively diminished in the process of thinking or debating. However, as mentioned in the beginning, this is not the only possibility to ensure a substantial difference between goal and starting point that can facilitate purposive thinking or debating. Of course, using different concepts to fulfill that role, like justification, can make smaller or larger adjustments to the rules of the respective processes necessary, and it would have to be ascertained in each case whether we are still talking about the same kind of process. A case in which at least no obvious adjustments would have to be made would be, for example, to ensure the necessary normative distance, would be a redetermination of the goal as the attainment of maximally well-justified beliefs on the one hand, and on the other hand, a case where adjustments would have to be made would be a classical pragmatism that defines the goal as attaining beliefs that are as useful as possible. A replacement for the distinction between truth and falsity to reinstate the required distance could help a theory like that of Protagoras from its predicaments. The example of pragmatism was not chosen by chance here, and as there is a pragmatically oriented reading of the Protagorean theory by F.C.S. Schiller that mainly draws upon the passage in which Socrates ascribes a surrogate conception of wisdom to Protagoras. That passage can be summed up as follows. Someone who has wisdom does not help others to attain truer beliefs, but better ones. In which sense exactly better is to be interpreted is not really spelled out in detail, but we can see from the examples that it is about beliefs that are on the one hand more pleasant if we are talking about individuals, or that are more useful if we are talking about beliefs that are supposed to be true for states. This could at least be a beginning for incorporating normative distance into the Protagorean theory, but it would also not be more than a beginning. The onus of applying it to a conception of debates and identifying both their goal and the correct way to pursue it would be on Protagoras or whoever decides to defend his theory. From this perspective, the self-refutation argument can be seen as a demand to make the process of a theory's dialectical examination intelligible from within that theory before even entering it. Without at least a basic understanding of this process, it is impossible for a theory to be defended in dialectical exchange. Additionally, in the specific case of Protagorean relativism, the problem arises that it is at least doubtful whether Protagoras could, even with a much more elaborate theory, convince his opponents of adopting a different conception or approach to debates, because here the same problems that he already would have had if he were to defend his use of the qualifiers apply all over again. As long as Protagoras' opponents' exclusive or at least primary orientation towards truth remains intact, and Protagoras has to concede their every statement's truth, that includes their beliefs about the purposes of debates. In this regard, Protagoras' universal concession of truth gives his opponents too much leverage on every new suggestion he could contribute. Probably Protagoras would have to eliminate truth as a value in debates wholesale, not only as a goal, but also as a criterion for the merit of contributions, if he were to defend a new conception of debates. Otherwise his opponents would always have an easy way to sidestep his arguments from the very beginning. Here the same problem arises, of course, all over again. To reason his opponents out of considering truth an important criterion in debates without ever claiming that they are just plainly wrong is probably bound to be unsuccessful. To develop a theory that can compete in the dialectical arena out of Protagorean relativism therefore seems quite hopeless. However, this is only the case if competing is understood in the strong sense of being able to convince opponents, because such an improved version of Protagorean relativism would at least not be the definite loser in every debate. It seems at least possible to achieve a draw here. However, the possibility to create distance in another way than through the distinction between true and false is important. Self-refutation arguments such as the one just examined always draw on the background of rules, the most obvious example of them being logical rules. And those rules do not necessarily have to be shared between all the participants in the debate. Therefore, to challenge those rules, either by saying that the opponent is interpreting the rules that are normally followed in the false way, or by questioning whether these are the rules that should be followed, is in principle a viable strategy for theorists threatened by self-refutation. It was already mentioned that this kind of self-refutation argument can be read as a demand to make intelligible the practice of dialectical examination from within the relevant theory. Whether this demand is met has to be ascertained in each case individually. This observation fits Castagnole's assessment that strongly revisionary theories are the typical target of self-refutation arguments, since revisionary approaches in epistemology often undermine old answers to the question of how debates or critical thinking are to be conducted, what they are good for, and why we pursue them at all. It is a reasonable demand on them to provide new answers before they can be seriously considered in a discipline that is practiced chiefly through argumentative exchange. It is, after all, about nothing less than the assessment of their own status as contributions to these debates. That is to say that the proponent of such a radically revisionist theory has a very, very thin line to walk. On the one hand, immunizing a theory against charges of self-refutation by drawing into question more and more of the rules of the background in the debate, or the rules the opponent thinks are in the background of the debate, is always an option. And it can, quite likely in every single case, at least avoid deducing its absolute falsity. This is often quite appropriately done, I would like to add, for example, when reminding the absolutist that it would be question-begging to reject a relativist theory because it denies that it is itself true absolutely. On the other hand, this immunization strategy isolates the theory from our familiar ways of approaching and evaluating theories. So if used too extensively and without giving appropriate alternative rules, that is, without introducing new instances of normative distance after discarding the old ones, we are left with no idea of what even to do with that theory. We simply do not know how to deal with such a theory fairly in a non-question begging manner because it has taken away all our familiar means of evaluation without providing us with any new ones. As I said earlier, Plato's self-refutation argument draws on a very, very specific feature of the Protagorean theory. That is, that Protagoras has to agree to everything that anyone says. Since most relativist theories do not share that feature, I would now like to shed some light on what other kinds of relativist theories typically do have that problem of a lack of normative distance, and which types don't, by discussing briefly a more modern successor of the Platonic argument that was put forth by Maria Bagramian in her monograph Relativism, and how this argument applies to different relativist theories. I will focus here on global eleithic relativism, often termed the strongest kind of relativism. My aim here is to show that even the strongest type of relativism is not susceptible to self-refutation as such, but that such susceptibility is strictly a matter of how exactly the relationship between the framework and what is relativized is spelled out. Bagramian herself puts forth a relativist view, albeit not a global one. Among the reasons why she does not consider global relativism a plausible theory is the following chain of thoughts that is quoted on the handout. It says, the relativist's position will become unintelligible only if he tries to convince the non-relativist of the superiority of his relativist scheme. But so long as the relativist is content to say, in my conceptual scheme, system of beliefs, etc., truth is relative, while for the members of society X or conceptual scheme Y, truth might be an absolutist notion, and I am in no position to say which of is right, his position will not be shaky. The point is, we can avoid the charge of self-refutation by embracing higher-order relativism. The acknowledgement of the possibility of an infinity of language levels is not in itself absurd or vicious. Such a stand would, of course, rob the relativist of the right to argue for the superiority of her position and would also force her to accept that an absolutist has something equally good to say about truth. This feature of strong relativism about truth, however, does not leave much room for relativistic philosophers, since they are trying to convince their opponents of the truth or superiority of their position by arguing for it. Hence, although total relativism is not self-defeating, arguing for relativism with non-relativists is. The core idea here, succinctly put in the last sentence quoted, is that the relativist is in some sense prohibited from arguing with the absolutist. Bagramian does not really go into the reasons why the relativist has to accept the absolutist theory as equally good, and therefore cannot argue with the absolutist, but I'd like to suggest that the reasoning behind this idea looks somewhat as follows, and this is the argumentary construction that is on the second page of the handout. It would start with the position that the absolutist's opinions differ from those of the relativist. Second step is an additional premise that says, if relativism is true, a difference in opinion means a difference in the framework used. Step 3, if relativism is true, the absolutist uses another framework than the relativist. Step 4, if relativism is true, it is futile for the relativist to try to convince the absolutist. 5, if the relativist tries nonetheless, she indirectly denies her own theory. It has to be stated from the outset that I am adopting a deliberately weak reading of Bagramian's stance here, not in the sense of ascribing it a weak supporting argument, but in the sense of making its claims as weak as possible, in the vein of making the argument as convincing as possible, because, as I said earlier, the most ambitious self-refutation arguments tend to fail. This is especially relevant for step 4, in which an ascription of futility is used as an intermediate step to derive the conflict of the relativist's actions with the relativist theory, instead of adopting the lack of a right to argue rhetoric that is used in the passage quoted above. The weaker reading simply fits much better with Bagramian's description of what embracing higher order relativism would look like. This self-refutation, of course, can only take place if the reasoning displayed above can establish that the conditional in step 4 holds, and there are indeed forms of relativism for which this argument poses a threat. these are the forms for which the assumption that is stated in step 2 is true. So that was that if a relativist, if relativism is true, a difference in opinion means a difference in the framework used. So this feature is, so to say, the counterpart to the Protagorean problem of having to agree to whatever anyone is saying for the applicability of Bagramian's argument, and it is significantly more widespread among relativist theories, although by no means universal. This can be the case, for example, when a strong relationship of determination between the framework and the beliefs of a user of the relevant framework is assumed, as is the case in some forms of cultural relativism. Such views of the relationship between frameworks and beliefs are already in themselves problematic, for the reason that they do not allow error inside a framework and let the development of new frameworks seem completely unintelligible. The self-refutation argument discussed here is another and no less serious difficulty for those kinds of theories that closely ties into the problem of not allowing falsity, again, very similarly to the Protagoras position. These theories seem to clearly lack normative distance, as is already evident in their making error impossible, because this impossibility immediately poses the question of what critical evaluations of beliefs should be good for. So, to destroy normative distance, it is not necessary that the framework and what is relativized must be strictly identical, although that is indeed the clearest case. It is sufficient that what is relativized cannot, so to speak, disappoint the framework's expectations, as is also the case when the latter simply determines the former. For other forms of relativism, it is less clear whether this argument applies to them. For example, coherence conceptions of truth that relativize truth to systems of basic beliefs or statements can validate the assumption in step 2, but they do not have to. It all depends on how exactly they employ the status of basic. On the one hand, it is plausible to categorize statements and beliefs about truth as basic, since they have consequences for the status of all statements and beliefs. On the other hand, it could be argued that theories of truth are rather abstract and not even considered by most people on anything like a regular basis, and as such, they do not have any function in everyday life. With a more practice-oriented approach to understanding basic, therefore, it would be more fitting to categorize theories of truth as something optional, since they are more of an intellectual embellishment without any practical consequences. In the latter case, it would be an open question whether the differing beliefs of the absolutists were a sufficient reason to ascribe a different framework to her. In another case, in any case, the assumption in step 2 is only partially valid for relativisms of this kind. It only holds for beliefs and statements that either belong to the framework or are immediate consequences of the framework. Furthermore, there are forms of relativism of which the assumption is clearly not true at all. For example, alethic relativisms that use language or symbol systems as frameworks. For these forms of relativism, it is definitely possible that both parties in a conversation are using the same framework and one of them is simply wrong. The relativist would, of course, consider the absolutist to be the one in error and would try to convince her of her being wrong in the shared framework. Additionally, it could even make sense for a relativist of this kind to enter a discussion with an absolutist who does, in fact, use a different framework. Of course, a shareable framework would have to be found, but if there is one, and if the parties are able to use one, that are able to use sufficiently similar frameworks, a debate can make sense from the perspective of the relativist. Even if the absolutist is using a different framework, this does not make her beliefs completely out of the reach of the relativist. It could either be the case that the absolutist is mistaken relative to her own framework, or that she is using an inadequate framework, for example, one that is useless for reaching her current epistemic goals. Thus, even if the absolutist is using a framework different from the relativist, the latter can have a motivation as well as the ability to convince the former without coming into conflict with the relativist stance. Finally, it should be mentioned that there are also theories that are susceptible to arguments of this kind without the assumption in step 2 having to be true of them, although it is in a certain sense. Those are, again, as with Protagoras, subjectivist theories, because for these it is just trivially true that the absolutist and the relativist are using different frameworks. That doesn't have anything to do with whether they disagree about anything or not. Even among subjectivist theories, though, some can avoid self-refutation through arguing for their position. For example, theories that relativize to a personal idealized system of beliefs and do not claim, or at least very severely limit, relativity to points in time, because it should indeed be possible to convince someone that her absolutist theory of truth does not cohere with her idealized system of beliefs. Here the question of the motivation of the relativist for arguing could be posed, but whether she is trying to correct her dialogue partner's false beliefs because of philanthropy or just because she is bored, this does not make arguing self-defeating. Thank you very much for your attention.